The Ghost of Tokai Manor, an extract from Blood Cartel, Book 2 of the Kat Drummond Series, by Woode-Smith.
It was a scorcher, more so than any usual summer day. Frederick Eckstein hoped it wouldn't put a damp on the New Year's Eve festivities. Well, it wouldn't if his father, Petrus, would help it. Put enough booze on someone's gullet, and they'd sing and dance through hell's inferno. And Frederick's father had more than enough booze, a cellar full, and no matter how much liquor was drunk, the cellar was always filled up the next day. Some people thought it was magic. Frederick knew better. Every time the cellar was restocked, the coffers just became a little bit lighter. But it couldn't be helped. Petrus loved parties, loved socializing, loved to make people laugh at bad jokes that they couldn't remember nor hear over the music, the cacophony of voices, and the miasma of liquor. Petrus, Frederick's father, loved the party more than anything else. Frederick sighed while grooming his chestnut mare. He had ridden her to Groot Constantia nearby in the heat of the day to pick up some more bottles of wine for tonight's party. It wasn't fair on her, but Frederick's father was insistent. Frederick stopped and frowned. Wasn't fair on him either. It wasn't his party, wasn't his job or anything. It was a favor to his father to fuel his insatiable hobby. Wasn't worth getting riled up over there. Petrus, Fred's father, was a good man at his core. He just wanted to make people happy, and it was New Year's Eve. If there was any reasonable excuse to party, this was it. "Fred!" Petrus called, coming towards the stables bearing a pair of wine glasses. Frederick smiled, even though he didn't feel like it, and turned towards his father. He noticed that the glasses were engraved with finery. The rims were gold. "Look at what I got for the party, Fred." I sincerely hope they are alone, Pa." Petrus faked a frown and then laughed, as if what Fred had said was the funniest of jokes. "Of course not. They're an investment. People can tell the difference between a loan and a true asset." "And do they care?" "Of course. It's all about respect, my boy. All about respect. And we mustn't let the other estates bring in more respect than us." "Why?" Frederick asked, honestly and straightforwardly. Petrus pondered the question, and then slapped Frederick hard on the back, jovially. "For the sake of it," he said with a laugh. "So I host these parties. You will thank me some day. This estate shall make it into the history books. All the colony shall envy you and your family. And talking about that," Frederick's cheeks reddened. Petrus grinned in response, a childlike exuberant grin. Frederick often wondered if Petrus really was his father, or just some greying older brother. "Anne tells me that Catherine will be at the party tonight." Frederick didn't think that his cheeks could get any hotter. They did. Petrus laughed again and patted Frederick on the back, but much lighter. "This is going to be a night to remember, my boy. The most memorable party we'll ever have." Frederick didn't respond. He only turned back and continued caring for his horse. Guests started arriving at sunset, which was late this time of year. Dinner was, suitably, to be served late. Even the nights were hot this time of year, but the Cape Dutch architecture of Tokai Manor maintained a comfortable coolness through thick stone walls and high ceilings. Chilled wine also kept people at a reasonable temperature until they were too drunk to care. Dinner was lavish, as it always was. Frederick wasn't sure where the money came from, but his father always managed to find enough to table the most massive banquets, only the best for his guests after all. After dinner, the dancing, drinking, and small talk of the inanest nature began once again. Frederick stood to the side as he always did, watching. Petrus was regaling his socialite buddies with gossip from other parties and the neighbouring estates, and Catherine was standing alone on the other side of the dance floor, an almost empty glass of red wine in her hands. Frederick was glad for the flush that liquor brought on, as it camouflaged his much more unbecoming blush. "Off to the side as usual, eh?" Frederick's friend Pete said, leaning against the wall. He looked to where Frederick had been staring and made an O expression. "The lady's daughter, high stations you both desire indeed." He grinned. Frederick took a sip of red and didn't reply. "Come on, Fred, go talk to her. The night is young yet and is slowly whiling away. Make the most of it. Will be a good start to the new year." Frederick grumbled some excuse that neither convinced Pete nor himself. "I'm your friend, Fred, and as a friend, I know what is best for you. Either go talk to her now, or I'm calling her over here." "No," Frederick said, just a bit too loudly. Some partiers stopped to stare. Frederick slumped his shoulders and a bit quieter repeated, "No, I'll go talk to her." Pete grinned. "That's the spirit. I'm rooting for you." For as much as that was worth, Frederick thought, but he crossed the dance floor all the same. Halfway across the room, Catherine looked up and smiled. Frederick couldn't help but smile back, despite the lump in his throat. An eternity later, Frederick arrived in front of Catherine, frozen, and then as Catherine was about to speak, bowed low, spilling some wine onto the floor. Would the lady like to dance? A pause. A dreadfully, murderously long pause. I would, if it pleases the gentleman. Frederick looked up, and Catherine was smiling, that beautiful, enchanting smile. Frederick felt that he could die right now, and if it was that the last thing that he saw, he would die happy. Frederick extended his arm, and Catherine accepted. She was warm, but it wasn't unpleasant warmth in this heat. It could never be. It was Catherine. They made their way to the centre of the dance floor, and once again Frederick's heart leapt into his throat. What type of dance? Everyone around them was doing something different. Slow dances, exuberant jigs, folk dances. Frederick froze up, but Catherine smiled. Let's do something slow. It's almost the new year. I want to conserve my energy, lest I swoon. Frederick nodded and began a slow waltz. Despite Frederick's shyness and introverted nature, at least compared to his father's socialite ways, he had received tutelage in dancing, and fell into the dance smoothly. Catherine closed her eyes, and let the soundless melody and motion of the dance carry her away. Time melted, and Frederick lost track of everything around him. All that mattered was to go before him, and the dance. Catherine, leaning in, broke him from his reverie. She opened her brown eyes. Thank you, Fred. I'm glad you asked me to dance. It's the first time. Frederick shrugged. A good way to end the year, and to start the next. Catherine laughed. It was beautiful. Well, I hope it isn't the last time. Fred! Petrus called. Fred! Catherine let go of Fred, much to his sorrow, and made way for Petrus to enter the fray. Even with his own semi-intoxication, Frederick could smell the waves of drunkenness rolling off his father, who staggered side to side to add the effect. Fred, he repeated. To his side was his brother Jakob, who looked equally drunk. My boy, your uncle said the darndest thing to me. Said, you tell him, Jacob. I said, Jacob said with a few slurs, despite his reddened cheeks and red-stained teeth, that despite your admirable skills in horsemanship, you could not and would not attempt to ride your horse into the house itself so to amuse the guests and make the ladies swoon. Dear uncle, Frederick replied, you are right in your assessment. It is much too dangerous. The veranda that makes this wondrous house so iconic is much too high. But you ride your horse on the mountain all the time, Petrus said. Are you suggesting that the steps leading up to my house are much higher than the steps leading up to Table Mountain? For I do not doubt that, considering the glory of this house. Jacob, Catherine, and a few bystanders laughed at his jest politely. Petrus grinned, his teeth were also stained by the red wine. Yours is a good mare, my boy. She'll do well in this. Humour your father, especially as he has money riding on this. Frederick couldn't help but roll his eyes. As well as being an addicted socialite and borderline alcoholic, his father was also a compulsive gambler. I have a full pound sterling on you being unable to rouse your mare to even mount the steps, Jacob added. Frederick shook his head. It is much too dangerous. Come on, Fred, one of Petrus's friends piped up. I'll add a pound to the wager. I've seen you ride. You can do it. Count me in, another added. Frederick gritted his teeth and looked at Catherine. Her smile had not dimmed. His eyes must have been asking for her opinion as she said, Do it quickly, Fred. I'd like to wish the new year with you. That wasn't assent enough. Hand me a bottle, Frederick said, to the cheers of everyone around him. He chugged the red in a single breath, and after liquid courage, left the building to the night summer's warmth. His mare neighed as he entered the stable. She must have smelled the liquor on his breath, as his attempts to calm her took a while. It's okay, girl, it's okay. We're going for a ride. Eventually, she calmed. Frederick looked at the saddle nearby and his riding equipment. In his dark and his drunken state, he didn't think he could negotiate the equipment onto himself or the tack onto the horse. He shrugged to nobody in particular. It would be a short ride. He had ridden his mare bareback before. He could do it now for the short trek. He managed to get the bridle bit onto the mare and negotiate the reins into what looked like the appropriate position in the fogginess of his inebriation. It would be enough, he thought. Frederick was a good rider, even in this state, and his mare was well trained. She made her way out of the stables and up the lawn towards the manor. Lamp on candlelight from within made the high-rise manor look like a mystical castle. Its steps looked like 1,000 miles high from the bottom. Frederick gulped. Come on, lad, let's see how you ride, someone called from atop the veranda. Well, girl, Frederick said, here we go. First, the mare thought the prospect of the steps ludicrous. She balked, but with coaxing she mounted them. Frederick held on for dear life as the incline grew, and the mare climbed the steps with increasing speed. With every step he felt he was falling further and further back. That last drink was a bad idea. And then he was on top of the steps. with people cheering around him. "That's my boy," Petrus cheered, a bottle in his hand. "Not yet," Jacob said. The wager was that he'd take the beast through the house, greet the rest of the guests. "Well, let us go," Frederick slurred. The mayor was incredulous at Frederick's directions, but followed through. They entered the wide hall of the manor. The hooves were heavy on the hardwood floors and made creaking noises over the revelry in the next room. Frederick and the mayor entered the party to playful screeches, cheers, and a toast to Frederick's horsemanship. Frederick beamed as a man only could when he had proven himself to some odd feat. People came to stroke and fiddle with his mare, and while sober he would have stopped them. In his state he could only look for Catherine, to ensure that she had seen what he had done, but she was nowhere to be seen. "Anybody seen Catherine?" Frederick asked quite inappropriately. No, the revellers paid him any mind. They were too busy drinking, chatting, exchanging bets with those who had won and lost the wager. The mayor was anxious, twitching and swaying. Frederick eventually noticed and placed his hand on the mare to calm it. It didn't like the noise, didn't like the fumes, didn't like the behavior of these humans acting more like animal than animals themselves. A man was trying to coax the mare to drink from a brandy glass, one of Frederick's father's new gaudy goblets. The horse was recoiling from the drink, but that man was insisting, grabbing the horse by the mouth. Frederick, anxiety rising at the absence of Catherine and the stress of his horse, looked around. He was boxed in by partiers. "Make room!" Frederick shouted. Nobody listened. The mad wouldn't stop trying to make the horse drink. He was being egged on by his comrades. The horse was getting really spooked now, looking for space that wasn't there. Frederick couldn't blame her. The adrenaline he had developed and turned into triumph during his feat was coagulating and turning to angst, to extreme anxiety. And where was Catherine? And eventually the horse could no longer handle it. It rose up on its hind legs and neighed. Everyone in the way of the hooves recoiled. Some laughed. "Oh, Petrus, your son may not be able to control the beast after all." "Nonsense, he is controlling the mare perfectly well, aren't you, boy?" Frederick, holding tightly and desperately onto the reins of the horse, didn't reply. He was losing control, and where was Catherine? Where was she to see his triumph? Wide-eyed and anxious, Frederick scanned the room. Catherine still wasn't there, and neither was Pete. Pete, Frederick's friend, his friend. Before Frederick could ponder the terrible thought for any longer, the mare finally had enough. She exited the room at breakneck speed. The people who screamed and laughed were equal. For Frederick, time slowed. For the mare, all that mattered was exiting this dreadful place, embracing the cooling night air, and getting back to the stables. The door was open, and the veranda was ahead, the veranda with its twin steep staircases. Frederick only needed to slow the horse down. A slow walk down the steps would be safe. It was summer, no rain to wet the steps, no chance of slipping. But the horse wasn't slowing down, and as Frederick pulled at its reins, it only balked and ignored him. Instead, it charged to the centre of the door, right towards the half-wall separating veranda and a long drop. I can stop her, Frederick thought, but he couldn't, and in his bestial frenzy of fear, the horse leapt over the half-wall. Frederick closed his eyes. He smelled liquor, he smelled horse, and he smelled Catherine's scent still clinging to him. He was drunk, and the tornado of inebriation still made the world swirl. Wind rushed up against him, and he breathed one final time and said, "Catherine." There's a lot of creative liberties you may have detected in that story. Firstly, Frederick's personality and his inner thoughts are, of course, my invention. And I did this in order to try to create some sort of personality for this named real-life figure, Frederick Eckstein, who we don't actually know much about. So he did not leave a journal of his final moments, obviously, so it's all conjecture, including his love and romance with Catherine, and also his relationship with his friends. Petrus, his father, and Jacob or Jakob, which you might notice I interchanged once or twice at least, by mistake. You can't blame me, I'm an English settler. Well, you could blame me for that even more. They are real people, however, and they were involved in the wager which led to Frederick's untimely death. There are some disagreements of how the horse died with its rider. Some retellings say that the horse leapt over the balcony, such as I have described in this story, while others state that while he attempted to climb down the steps, the horse slipped and they all went tumbling down. What we do know is that this escapade was caused by a bet, that Frederick's father was a gambler, a debtor, a drunkard, and a partier. And we also know that both horse and rider died. But the myth doesn't stop there. Since that fateful New Year's Eve, many denizens of Tokai Forest who have had the misfortune to travel through the forest at night swear they can hear a horse riding and whinnying, but find no evidence of horse running during the day. Some more, in quiet whispers, even swear that they have seen the spectral rider in the night, bloodied and broken, and wearing clothes of another age. And every New Year's Eve, this rider is said to try to reattempt his feat another time and to attempt to get it right. And they swear that this rider is Frederick Eckstein, the ghost of Tokai Manor. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Cape Folklore on the History Society. I hope you enjoyed. It's quite unusual to have mythology in a typically factual, historical channel, but I hope you enjoyed it all the same. If you would like to support me and the podcast, please check out my Patreon at patreon.com/Nicholas Woode-Smith. The link will be provided in the description. You can also follow us on Facebook with the History Society. Thank you to this episode's Patreon supporters, Becky McLaughlin, Cameron Luke Wilson, Deborah West, and Nancy Clare. Thank you. I really appreciate it, and I hope that you'll join me next time for the next episode.
Thank you for listening to this extract from Blood Cartel. If you would like to read more about Cape mythology in an urban fantasy setting, you can check out the Kat Drummond Series on Amazon. Link in the description.